Hello and welcome to my feedback for group consisting of Randy, Kenneth, Stephanie, and Todd. Randy, thank you very much for facilitating that discussion. And so let me share some of the reflections that I had listening to your collaborative discussion on the topics in this first Hangout. So the first question that you addressed was the one about warnings and strategic versus tactical issues in the spring and summer pre-9/11, and different intelligence community members that had different pieces of a puzzle, so to speak, about the strategic trends in the threat landscape that led to 9/11 events. And so, Kenneth, you talked about the fact that, in the spring and summer of 2001, there were different flags and indicators that the threat levels, particularly in that near far enemy, were imminent. And what I mean by near and far enemy is the concept that traditionally during the Cold War era, and at the same time when we're speaking about the religious terrorism, the tendency was for those militant groups to focus on the countries of proximity. So generally, when you talk about religious terrorism, it was concentrated in the geographical area, was targeting, Saudi Arabia or Israel, and there wasn't that very big discourse of taking the fight to the far enemy, which in this case was the United States. But strategically, clearly the 9/11 Commission report indicates that strategically we could have seen emerging trends. It was at the tactical level that those different actors in the intelligence community had different pieces of information that they were not being able to put into the larger picture. And then also you were discussing the fact that there was so much information, and yet the threats were not specific enough to where the actions were undertaken. So that brought the discussion into the from the strategic and tactical. They had a lot of information. Strategically, they should have been forming a larger picture, and yet those calls were not made. And you had a discussion, I think Randy talked about it, when was it safe to call it, and who would take that responsibility to actually heed the warnings that were there. And a really critical part of this whole discussion that we are having on Homeland Security intelligence, because this is what we sort of going in a direction of in this course, is being able to track the difference between domestic intelligence and foreign intelligence. And so the understanding, I think Kenneth didn't really have a good grasp on those differences between FBI and CIA. You have to look at it historically, that we did not develop a very strong domestic intelligence process, and the intelligence community was not really focused on a domestic intelligence collection because of the history of the intelligence in the United States. And certainly CIA has a mandate being purely intelligence agency, of doing it on the foreign soil. So you don't have the constitutional constraints, and the Fourth Amendment does not come into play. Whereas when you're talking about collecting intelligence on Americans, this is very strongly not in our constitutional DNA, so to speak. And I want to put it in a more historical perspective for you. If you think about terrorism, modern terrorism, it was sort of labeled, you mentioned that terrorism has existed since time immemorial. Sun Tzu, 4,000 years ago, talked about spying, on troop movements and things like that. But as far as domestic and spying on your own people, you can track the birth of terrorism in the French Revolution at the end of 1700s. If you remember from history, the French Revolution abolished the king and the monarchy. So it totally changed the political system that was at the time prevalent in Europe. And France was the only country that did that and was surrounded by other kings and monarchies. And so when the revolution happened, it was like a young baby that needed to be protected, so to speak, because there was no process, there was no political thought developed. There was this new order of things, the ideas of liberty and fraternity and equality that were all enmeshed in this emerging new order of things. But, when you abolish something, like monarchy, the order that was existing, and creating something new, there were a lot of vulnerabilities and threats. So the founders of the revolution, of the French Revolution, realized that it was very vulnerable. And so in the name of national security, so to speak, to protect that young baby revolution, they instituted a set of draconian laws to prevent any threat to that new order, particularly from other countries, but also from the citizens themselves. And in France, particularly, it was the peasants that were not very happy with the new order because it wasn't any better for them. They still had to feed the revolution like they had to feed the king. So there was a lot of dissent. And of course, in the revolution, different revolutionary movements had their own agendas. So there was a lot of friction. And if you wanted to safeguard this new order of things, you had to institute certain laws to protect it. And the father of the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre, together with Danton, organized what was called the Committee of Public Safety. And the Committee of Public Safety in France did exactly what MI5 does. So it was the institution that was supposed to be looking internally at intelligence or collecting information on citizens to make sure that they are not speaking bad or going against the revolution. That was the concept. And the concept was very idealistic to protect those ideas of liberty and equality and fraternity. But what it also caused, it triggered a set of policies such as the law of suspects. And the law of suspects said that, if you are suspected of being against the revolution, then you're a threat to that national security. So people from the Committee of Public Safety would frequent gatherings, taverns, pubs, associations, intellectual circles, and they were eavesdropping. And they were looking at who was a potential enemy of the Republic. And very soon you had a myriad of accusations that started proliferating about different individuals, of course, driven by different agendas. And those people were being brought in front of those one-day courts that were almost like in the times of Inquisition, determining the guilt. And usually, if you were suspected, you were found guilty. And this is when the French terror started, where people were guillotined en masse in public places to instill in people the fear that they were not to be against that new baby republic. And so in the interest of national security, a reign of terror was born. And this was the beginning of sort of institutionalized state terror. That's where we have a notion of terrorism, from the French. And as much as you understand their motivations to institute those kind of structures. In the historical context, certainly when we're looking at it from the perspective of civil liberties, it was a really bad thing. And so subsequently in history, other revolutions, like Russian Revolution of 1917, 1918, instituted very similar structures. So, it was the revolution for the people, by the people, and yet anybody against it, so nobility and landowners, were being persecuted by internal and spied on by internal police, which was NKVD, which later became a KGB. So in that context, you had abuse of power, repressive government structures, just very similar to France, where a lot of people died in gulags and camps in Siberia, as a result of the Russian Revolution. And certainly very similar internal security structures were instituted in East Germany. Post-World War II, there was the organization called Stasi, which was, an MI5, so to speak, so that internal police, that their job was to provide intelligence about certain individuals with the agenda against the Soviet Union and the order that was imposed in East Germany by the Soviets. And then when you look at a little bit more modern era, it was Iran during the time of the Shah Reza Pahlavi that had internal security police called Savak. And so historically, historical lessons from institutionalized spying agencies in domestic context have been fraught with abuse of power, agendas, personal agendas, repressions, and violation of civil liberties. So in that context, we are now assessing, our domestic security landscape and the role of domestic intelligence viewed from the from the perspective of looking at your own citizens, not at those at the foreign soil like the MI6 or CIA would be preoccupied with. The fundamental difference between CIA and FBI was that after 1947, clearly CIA was given a mandate to do all types of clandestine, which means covert, secret activities not bound by the Constitution of the United States on foreign citizens. FBI was given a very similar mandate within the US to spy on foreign nationals in the US who wanted to do us harm. So politicians of different countries, diplomats installed in our diplomatic consulates and embassies here, businesses that were foreign, that might have been involved in economic espionage and stealing patents and things like that. That's historically what FBI was doing, but it was a very, very small fraction of its operations. All other intelligence, as it involves law enforcement, is criminal intelligence, which is different from that secret spying, so to speak, where you have the element of suspicion, but you are not you're not bound by that probable cause and being able to articulate the elements of a crime, and that's a difference between criminal intelligence and that intelligence in the classical sense that has to do with secrecy that evolved for us on a foreign soil. So certainly, if you are in a different country, let's take Iraq, you can certainly do surveillance of a mosque. You cannot do that in the United States because we do have a freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. So if you are, executing a drone strike on a town in Pakistan, certainly collateral damage has a totally different meaning than it would have to if you did it in the United States. So this separation between the two agencies historically is on the ways we did that from the constitution standpoint. What is, the ground rock of our democratic society versus what we do overseas is totally different. So now this is, of course, all the way through going to 9/11, or at least coming out of the Cold War. The other difference, or the other issue about the FBI and CIA that it's really important to understand is that the way you produce human intelligence, or human, so your data collection source, and there are many data collection sources for intelligence purposes. We're going to discuss that in subsequent weeks. But the human intelligence, or talking to people and getting info out of people, is a different process historically with foreign intelligence than it is with domestic or criminal intelligence. So case in point, for criminal intelligence, typically we grow human intelligence out of confidential informers. Confidential informers are typically, in a criminal justice process, people that are part of a criminal enterprise. Those people generally have an insider knowledge, and in order to plea, or in order to get a lesser sentence, or in order to secure some other criminal justice system favors, they agree to collaborate with the criminal justice system. Certainly, this is not a case in the way historically the tradecraft of foreign intelligence was conducted. So foreign intelligence human is called assets, and assets are the sources of information, or the people that are not criminals and they are not part of that criminal enterprise. They are typically actors that have the information but have a different motivation to provide it. So the motivations are more intrinsic, which means that they are wanting to change a system in their country. They want to better their processes in the country. They want to provide their hearts and minds to support a cause that they believe in. Let's say, the United States trying to interfere with some processes in the local context there in a different country. Let's say before Iranian Revolution, the United States being very supportive of the Shah. So somebody who would be an asset, who would be somebody that supported that particular political system in that country. And they were willing to give us information because they believed that that was what was the best for the country. So as you see, the motivation for foreign intelligence collection is different by those people than it might be for your criminal intelligence processes within the United States. And FBI, certainly when it was collecting foreign intelligence on foreign individuals in this country, the motivations of people that would provide it were, if you are doing something against Russian government, you would have Russian citizens, intellectuals who were against their existing structures in Russia, and they wanted to help American intelligence community with that information. A lot of times that information is very expensive and we pay for it to the assets. But again, it's very important to understand that historically those motivations of those two groups have been different. Therefore, that intelligence process evolves differently as well for criminal intelligence as it is for foreign intelligence. And the other thing, as far as differences is, and this sort of domestic foreign interaction, is that historically, FBI and CIA were two agencies that were culturally very opposed one to another. So CIA considered itself very elitist for intelligence, and the FBI considered itself, the law enforcement agency that is preoccupied with the criminal justice system. So within the bounds of criminal law in the United States. So very, very different DNA, so to speak, for both of organizations. And I think that's really important to understand when we start talking about FBI assuming the role of domestic intelligence safeguard agency post 9/11. Because historically it had a different role, not on domestic intelligence collection. So, I just wanted you to realize those historical underpinnings. So there's a really big discussion, I think. Randy was talking about some other differences would be the classification systems. And definitely, competitive intelligence existed. At those days running up to 9/11, where those different members of intelligence community had expertise in different collection disciplines. Now, we haven't talked about collection disciplines in depth. We're going to talk about different collection disciplines in subsequent weeks. Human is one I already mentioned. Of course, there are others. As you looked at the presentation on intelligence community, you know that those different agencies have very strong points in either doing satellite imagery or, or doing all type intelligence versus a specific type, geo intelligence versus, measurements and so on and so forth. So within them, of course, they would have different sort of cooperating picture to set a shared strategy for intelligence process, because if the need to know across different agencies is different, then certainly different classification processes make it hard to share. And then, of course, the classification system, I think the point Stephanie was making is sometimes what is classified certainly becomes, as it becomes secret, is not shared, and a lot of times the reasons for classifying are not very clear, because you can get a lot of that information through open sources, and yet when it is classified, it becomes a problem. And, case in point, you can have an FBI student in a program after Snowden leaks that could not discuss in class those leaks, because for the agency itself, that stuff was still classified, which is, a paradox in itself, which, I thought I'll make that comment linking to Stephanie's. You had a discussion on false positives and how the false positives within that context of domestic versus foreign, how much tolerance do we have for false positives and how much we can accept domestically versus internationally. And obviously, when you are earmarked for suspicion, for fly lists, for screenings, for, in big data collection net, and there is a suspicion that centers on you and you are not involved in that activity, that certainly has a more chilling effect domestically than it has on foreign soil, because we're certainly not as preoccupied with civil liberties of citizens of Iran, for example, versus US Constitution. Now, Fourth Amendment does not apply to an Iranian citizen. So it's a lot easier, and it's a different environment that the CIA case officer is going to work than somebody who is a member of a law enforcement community in the United States that is bound by the Constitution. So false positives certainly don't preoccupy us as much in the international context, but when they become numerous in a domestic context that raises the issues of civil liberties and effectiveness of the intelligence process on a domestic soil. You had a discussion on hypervigilance and a lot of noise and the ability to be able to discern relevant information from noise with big data. And Stephanie, I think, mentioned hypervigilance, and you had discussions on the issues of profiling and what hypervigilance leads to, and that's of course all the results of intelligence processes in a domestic setting. I think, Kenneth, you talked about something that I thought it was interesting as far as secrecy, and you mentioned that there was an unwritten rule that you do not spy on Americans. This is not an unwritten rule. It is very important to realize that it is our constitutional constraint not to spy on Americans. People should be free in their persons, documents, and possessions and residences from unreasonable searches, and no such should occur unless there is a probable cause, right? And there is a high threshold for probable cause. Whereas when you're talking about intelligence, and particularly the one that is obtained from assets, right, and sources, then that probable cause is not there. There is a reasonable suspicion, like, in the French Revolution, where you had a certain level of suspicion, the law of suspects, that warranted an opening of subsequent investigation. So again, this is not an unwritten rule. There's something that is very, very anchored in our constitutional rights. Search and seizure, when we are talking about our records, phone records, our tablets, our, all the things that have to do with our personal data, then grabbing it through those large databases and searches and stuff like that is, in a way, the violation of our basic rights in a democratic system. And that is why those issues of civil liberties are being raised. I listened to your conversations about the balance, about how you, on one hand, should surrender some expectation of privacy for the sake of security, but then when do you know that you have surrendered too much, or when do you know when it's too late to get some of those civil liberties back? And I think this is a discussion perhaps that might be generational, because if you have not lived through the abuse of power and through those systems being repressive, then it might seem, very idealistically, that you don't have anything to hide. Therefore, you do not mind the system to be more intrusive because you want to contribute to the overall national security. I will tell you that unless you live through the violation of privacy, and it comes to you unexpectedly, it might be very hard to relate to that. And the millennial generation, perhaps, although I hate to use the term millennial, because I'm not even sure if there's such a thing exists, but let's say your generation has different historical experiences, and it might be different for different groups of people, different generations, to look at that aspect of privacy differently. So for me, I grew up in Poland, and in 1981, Poland experienced what was called a martial law. Basically what happened, the communist system was crumbling, and the people started calling for unionizing. and for abolishing the existing political structure. And there was a call for a mass strike. And so the government, knowing the government that was very strongly under the Russian dominance, realized that if people go out in the streets, then the Russians will come in and invade Poland, and it's going to end up in a bloodbath. So they instituted the martial law, so people don't go out, so they don't have a right to gather and to create those big riots across the country. And so when the martial law was instituted, it was a sort of protective mechanism, so to speak, to make sure that the larger harm doesn't happen to the country. But for the civil liberties, it was a tremendous violation. And I remember being a teenager where there were raids that were concurrent to my grandmother's house, my aunt's house, and our house. And there was military supported by deputized local police for that purpose. And they basically came without search warrants in the middle of the night, and they were looking for anything that could show that our families were against the existing regime. And so there was no indication or evidence other than not belonging to political party at the time. There was only one party, it was a Communist Party. And my family, traditionally, very patriotic, we were not part of the political system. And that was it. And that was enough to warrant excessive searches for everything. That included guns, that included money, that included literature, that included, what you had in a refrigerator, that included the way you lived. And this type of invasion has marked me and impacted me in my entire adult life. And that's something that, I carry with me, that forms my philosophy on security. Because that day I promised myself that I will never live in a country where somebody can walk into your home in the middle of the night without a warrant and without a probable cause, just because they were trying to make sure that there were no elements there that could, in the long run, hurt the nation as a whole, so to speak, or they were subversive, or they were dissident. So keep that in perspective when you have those conversations. Randy, talked about the slippery slope and moving that line, but I want you to look from this perspective of, it's good to say, I think we should surrender our expectation of privacy as long as it's not yours, because we only know about those processes as much as they happen to us. And if you have been profiled, and if you have been abridged in those rights, and if you had suspicion happen to you, then you might be looking at it and framing that a little bit differently. So you talked about I don't want to be watched all the time. I think Stephanie talked about it, even though I've got nothing to hide. I don't want to be watched. And certainly, that's a good argument. And with that came a very, very good example that you had. And I'm not sure who brought it up. It might have been Ken, about the sex offender databases. The fact that, we do have sex offender places of residence and so on and so forth, and it's a public knowledge. And you had a discussion on the fact that, a sex offender is somebody that has been convicted in a criminal justice system, whereas somebody who is just talking, right, who has not yet committed a crime, cannot be paralleled with a sex offender. So I really like that discussion, because you were sort of underscoring that slippery slope on big data and big data collection. The discussion on the intelligence community as defined, the 16-member intelligence community versus what we call the frontline of community, being local law enforcement, and how that intelligence process changes. I think that in order to discuss that, you need to talk about federalism and local also in the context of the United States. And certainly federal agencies with their intelligence capabilities have totally different relationships with the society than do local law enforcement. So with that comes a totally different threshold in the approach to intelligence, because federal agents that, let's take, for example, the removal officers from ICE, they remove people in localities and communities they do not know. They are external to them. And certainly those decisions are happening in the intelligence community at a much higher level, at the federal level. So there are so many degrees of separation from the general public. When you have local law enforcement, those are the people that live in the communities, that walk those communities every day, that have children in schools in those communities, that interact with people and build trust. And their effectiveness in crime prevention and in investigations is very strongly linked to that trust at the community level. So if you now take that police officer and have them spy within the local community, that sort of breaks potentially that social contract that local policing has within that community. So intelligence understood this way, particularly, I'm not talking about the evidence in criminal investigations and criminal intelligence, which is different. I'm talking the solving the mysteries, asking neighbors, hey, if you hear something, that person does something, or, give me a call if you think that somebody is doing something suspicious. That certainly, once you have those false positives, and the feds come in into the local community and arrest that person, that, and it comes from the community level, that really destroys the fabric at the local level. So in a way, local law enforcement is the first, their eyes and ears, and through community policing and stuff, they're doing their traditional roles of situational awareness and so on and so forth. But they're also in a very vulnerable position to, where it comes to intelligence, the role is different than those federal agencies that cast a big net and they just go for trends and big things. They don't really zoom in on the individuals, because those individuals are very far removed from their theater of operations, so to speak. And in a very similar fashion, the intelligence organizations that deal with the foreign element also do not really worry about those community implications. So when we bring everything into Homeland Security, remember, Homeland Security happens at the most local level. And then the intelligence concept, particularly with respect to civil liberties, might become hairy. And I think that's, those are the discussions that you had. You talked about, in order to have more security, we may have to abandon some liberties. And certainly, I think you talked about TSA. TSA was a new agency established after 9/11. We did not have TSA. Obviously, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, you knew that there were severe failures, on the part of FAA and coordinating with those different members of intelligence community. So we felt the need to establish a TSA. And after 9/11, people were very willing to surrender some of our civil liberties for the sake of national security. And as the time goes by, and we get complacent and nothing happens, there is perhaps a time to revise some of those invasive processes sometimes, or at least if nothing else, look at their effectiveness, because one of the questions was, what is a pound of intelligence worth? And then when do you know you have a pound of intelligence? And certainly looking at effectiveness of those false positives, if you have a lot of them, just to get one piece of evidence that perhaps you could have gotten in a different way, that you start rethinking the whole concept of how that intelligence process is set up. So I thought you had, very interesting debates on that. You also talked about the ever-changing nature of threats, and that, with respect to, and I think it has been, Stephanie had that discussion with respect to new processes, new technologies, and new threats. Perhaps, human intelligence as a data collection, was very effective in Cold War, because there's a long time to train people, to have them learn the language. If you wanted to embed them in a particular country, on a particular community, on a particular environment, that environment was rather stable. So Russia had its borders, and they were not changing. And it had its language, and it wasn't changing. And it had that many scientists, and they were not traveling anywhere. There is a certain set of them. And so operating in that environment as a human intelligence, with human intelligence and assets, there was enough time to grow those. And that process was also very, very expensive, but it was more feasible. And when you're talking about now, and the threats changing, and the threat landscape changing, those threats are in cyberspace, in networks, in places where human intelligence is not that effective. And of course, you would need so many different assets to be reporting, that you don't almost have the analytical capability. First of all, you don't have enough power to train. The linguistic environments changed. Before, you needed to speak Russian to get into Russia and to infiltrate that environment to get your information. Today in Russia, you have to know about 100 different languages, because all different regions that broke out liberated themselves from the official language being Russian. So now you've got Tajik, you've got Ukrainian, you've got all those different linguistic groups, and growing human intelligence for that is very complex and very expensive and very labor intensive. And the threats are progressing and moving and changing rapidly. So human intelligence, from that big strategic standpoint, the way we do operations in foreign contexts might not be the most optimal way of collecting intelligence today, even though it yields very, very reliable product. When you discussed also the civil unrest and profiling and stuff like that, you said, I think you mentioned something about those being touchy subjects. I think the reasons they are touchy is because, again, they are grounded in the Constitution. So now the question is, how much of the Constitution do you think is going to need to be revised in, future decades in order to allow for shifts in the way we collect data on American citizens? Do we need to make some allowances for that? And so, is it a touchy subject? It's definitely a big object of debate, and look at the current political climate and intelligence and what's happening in all those councils and so on, to realize the almost the inability to manage the intelligence processes right now. Again, I think Kenneth is more of a view that, you know, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you don't really have to worry about somebody looking into you. And that's a, you know, a principal question is, you know, how do you know what's being looked at and for what purpose, and who sets those requirements? And do you know how those requirements are being set? And, you know, because intelligence is such a wicked animal in a way, we don't know much about it until there are leaks or until there are intelligence failures. But generally, public is not very privy to those processes. And in fact, MI5 in the UK, even though, you know, it exists, it was clandestine. It was a secret organization to the public until the 1980s. And even today, after the 7/7/2005 events in the bombings in London, there is quite a lot of conflicting research whether MI5 is effective or not. So you're talking about creating the environment of awareness, but the environment of awareness sometimes is difficult to achieve if it's shrouded in secrecy. And the intelligence philosophy, you know, particularly that secrecy, does not allow, unless again you have leaks. And look at how we look at the leakers, you know, are they patriots or are they traitors? You know, and we have very conflicting view on that. They allow us to have a glimpse into accountability of the government and what the government is doing and for what purpose. At the same time, you might argue that this strike at the very national security of our country. But then, of course, you have to think back to the French Revolution and wonder, you know, at what cost are you going to safeguard liberties and liberties of whom and how, who makes those decisions? So I think that, you know, some clarification on, you know, when you were talking about whether we should have a totally separate intelligence agency or whether we should strengthen and reform homeland security structures, for example. You were mentioning umbrellas and different umbrellas and so on and so forth. I think that you need to realize that the way we are structured, we've got departments. So, you know, the Department of Justice, where FBI is situated, and CIA is linked to the State Department, but it's the independent agency with direct link to the Director of National Intelligence. And so the question to pose, I think, on that is, can FBI, with its very strong focus on criminal intelligence, law enforcement intelligence, does it have organizational culture that allows for those clandestine or those totally different ways of collecting information on citizens? And certainly that has changed since the Patriot Act, and, you know, this door was open wide. But is the FBI the best agency to do that, or, you know, should they stick to the knitting, so to speak? And again, I'm going to remind you, FBI had a mission for intelligence, but on foreign people living here. Spying on Americans became a brand new day with the Patriot Act. And of course, that has been very controversial. So in a discussion whether we should have a separate department, you're already looking at a Department of Homeland Security, and we're talking about Homeland Security Enterprise and Homeland Security Intelligence. And in this course, we are going to discuss more what it means. You know, what is Homeland Security Intelligence really? Does it follow the same process as foreign and national intelligence? Does it, is the all hazards really allowing for the same processes as the intelligence community does? So I think Kenneth was for all for MI5 type of agency, but you discussed all the issues related to, we already have a $70 billion budget for 16-member intelligence community. That's one of the most fragmented in the world. And so we already have all those different players and a lot of money we spend with 5 million people in that enterprise. And of course, we have developed 17 years of Department of Homeland Security. Are we going to go back now? If we were to form the new intelligence agency, wouldn't it have been beneficial to do it right after 9/11, where we did not have so much investment into DHS? So if DHS is going to be this sort of clearinghouse for intelligence for domestic purposes, how it can better fulfill that role, this is sort of a question to think about going forward. All right, so costly. I think Stephanie might have mentioned that it could have been a good time to do it then. So those are sort of my loose comments about some of the discussion points that you have. What is intelligence worth? How are we going to know that? It's difficult to measure something that hasn't happened, right? Something that you have prevented, particularly if there is a very strong classification system on some of that stuff and the general public does not know those processes, then it's going to be harder to justify investments in them. A recent study on efficiency of TSA was quite abysmal. So, you're just wondering if those security measures that severely abridge civil liberties, whether they are effective, by actually testing them. So their ability to detect. And if you have so many false positives, does it really justify all those people under suspicion? And then when you actually have a real threat that falls through the crack, in a case in point, and I don't know if your group discussed that, but one of the groups talked about the call made to the FBI about the shooter from Florida. And certainly, I remember being on the duty desk when I was the agent, and it was, one of the most horrible assignments that you could have. But you had the list of usual suspects and the people that call, they had all kinds of different mental issues, and, the ones that call regularly. And then you had red flags and indicators. And as an agent, you were able to assess the credibility of that call or of that threat. But since those call centers got more centralized and there are people, there are more analysts that were assigned to those, or even people in the administration and not agents, then you created that removal of somebody that's actually collecting intelligence every day or collecting stuff, removed from that decision-making process. So regionalization, other things happen, that let that little stuff fall through the cracks. And while we have a terrorist screening database, the terrorist screening center, which was established when I was an agent and I was on a temporary duty assignment and worked there, if it has, 100,000 records of people suspected of terrorism, but nobody is analyzing them based on any actionable criteria, when, there are different spellings of names and, the cases are redundant and we are collecting a lot of stuff, but the analytical capability is not there. how important is that big data collection? How effective is it? And I think that when Dahl talks about what is a pound of intelligence worth, it's about instituting some type of measurement, and also being more focused on the analytical capability than on that collection ability. But we will certainly talk about that, or you're talking about that this week, because you're talking about truly, we're starting getting into the, what is the intelligence? It has to come, in order to be considered intelligence in a true traditional sense, it has to go through the process. It has to be requested for a very specific reason. It has to then be collected through a variety of different methods, and then it has to be exploited and separated for relevant from non-relevant. And then it has to be corroborated and triangulated and go through so-called analytical process. And then the product needs to be disseminated, and then you need to receive feedback on how actionable it was, and you have to look whether it served the purpose or not, and whether it aligned with the requirement. At each step of that process, there are many factors that come into play. For requirements, you've got policymakers and politicians, and all that. At the collection side, you have a separation of collectors from analysts. At the analytical side, you've got biases and psychological processes. So we are going to be talking about all of those in a course. But certainly, when you get down to the value of intelligence, you are looking at the dissemination, certainly, feedback, certainly, and how it is acted upon and decision-making in the intelligence community. So I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I'm looking forward to your subsequent ones. Thank you for facilitating it, and I'm glad you didn't have any technical issues, and I'll see you on discussion boards this week.